Thanks a Lot Universe by Chad Lucas. Chapter 18. Weird. Ezra. My heart beat a kick drum rhythm when the door swung open. A boy with shaggy hair sized me up, then grabbed the pizza. I assumed this was Richie. "Brian," he yelled, "your friend brought food." He ran off with the box and I took a cautious step inside. Richie parked on the couch and attacked the pizza. Behind him, a door along the far wall opened, and Brian stepped out. A bunch of feelings surged through me all at once. Pride that I'd found him, relief he was safe, and the unnerving crushed flutter in my chest that had grown more intense all year. "Hey," I said. He leaned against the doorframe, arms across his belly. "Hey." Maybe it was my imagination, but he seemed skinnier and paler than usual. His eyelids drooped like he wanted to curl up and sleep. I wanted so badly to rush across the room and hug him, but that would be weird. He turned to his brother. "Richie, slow down. Did you even say thank you?" Richie looked up, cheeks swollen with cheese. "Thanks," he mumbled. Brian rolled his eyes. "Don't mind Richie, he has no manners. But honestly, thanks, He trailed off. "You should eat too," I said. He shook his head. "I'm not hungry. Are you okay?" Wrong question. He dipped his head, letting his hair fall over his eyes. "Yeah, things are just weird," I finished. "Yeah. Tell me," I want to say. "Tell me everything." "How did you find this place?" I asked instead. He shrugged. "I booked it online." "Seriously?" "He snuck us into a hotel yesterday, too," Richie bragged. "Brian's a genius." Brian smiled. "I always suspected you were hiding your superpowers," I said. He froze. Was that the wrong thing to say, too? I was trying to lighten the mood, but what if he saw through me? "Like being a secret jerk puncher," I added, forcing a laugh. Brian covered his face. "Everyone's talking about that, aren't they? Now they think I'm even more of a freak." Colby's words echoed in my head. "Ghost has been weird all year. Maybe he has mental issues." It made my stomach churn. "You're not a freak," I said. "Can you guys talk somewhere else?" Richie called. "I'm trying to watch TV." Brian's cheeks flushed. "Sorry, Ezra, I'm being rude. Come in." I followed him to the bedroom. My heart kicked up the tempo. Other than those few minutes on a bus, we'd never hung out alone, just the two of us. I'd imagined it plenty of times, though never in such strange circumstances. The room was big enough for a double bed and a dresser, and not much else. Brian sat at the head of the bed, and I sat at the foot, so he wouldn't think I was trying to get too close. "Sorry," he said again. "I should have illegally faked my way into something bigger, with a hot tub." I laughed. He blinked, and the surprise on his face slowly dissolved into a smile. He never made jokes, not around other people anyway. "I'm dying to know how you guys snuck into a hotel," I said. He began slowly, growing more animated as he warmed up. I watched his hands, his jiggling knee, his hair drifting across his eyes. By the time he described how he nearly panicked and fled the hotel barefoot in a wet swimsuit, I was cracking up. "That's awesome, like a Home Alone movie." He grinned. "Did anyone else at North ever hear him talk this much?" "Your turn," he said. "How did you get here?" I remembered Gabe and Brittany in the driveway, probably growing impatient. "Mrs. Cleland's son drove me." Brian's eyes widened. "You told Mrs. Cleland?" "No," I fumbled out a version of my odd day. Brian hugged his knees to his chest when I mentioned his mom. "Did she seem okay?" I wasn't sure how to answer. "She misses you. She wanted me to tell you." The door swung open. Gabe filled up most of the frame. "We need to talk," he said, "before things get way more complicated." We sat in a row on the couch, Brian at one end, me at the other, Richie in the middle. Brian stood with Brittany at his side and explained his mom had called him because all of her states had called her because the social worker had called him. Brian and Richie had been gone long enough that the social worker wanted to put out an official missing kids alert. "So unless you want your pictures on the internet, you need to come with us," Gabe said. Richie perked up. "Cool, we'd be famous." "We don't want to be famous, Rich." Brian rubbed his forehead. "Why did Sergeant States call Mrs. Cleland?" "We've known Oliver forever," Gabe said. "He was good friends with my dad." Brian stiffened. He sank into the couch and crossed his arms. The Brian who'd been laughing in the bedroom was gone. He stared at the floor. "I'm not going back to the Wenzel's house." Brittany wrinkled her nose. "Who?" "The cranky old people we've been stuck with," Richie said. "Ever since Mom..." "Richie." Brian's tone was so sharp the room fell silent. "I'm not taking you there," Gabe said. "You're coming home with me." Brian stared. "To Mrs. Cleland's house?" Gabe smiled. "I live there too." Brian had sat stunned. I wanted to tell him maybe it would be okay, but I doubted he wanted my opinion right now. "Do you play video games?" Richie asked. Gabe chuckled. "Yeah, I have a PlayStation 4. "Do you have the newest Call of Duty? I hear it's awesome." Gabe shook his head. "I don't do war games." "Why not?" "My dad was in the military. He died last summer." Brian covered his face. "Richie, oh my god." "It's okay," Gabe straightened. "Here's the deal. You don't have to tell me your business. I know sometimes life sucks and bad things happen. But Mom is worried about you, and you're making her sad. She's had enough to be sad about." Gabe stopped. His eyes welled up. Brittany rubbed his back. The three of us on the couch sat in silence. I risked a glance at Brian. He watched Gabe wide-eyed. Gabe wiped his eyes. So you're coming with me. You'll let Mom look after you and you won't give her any more grief. That's how it's gonna be. Deal? Deal, Brian whispered. Gabe gave him time to pack his things. I offered to help, but Brian shrugged me off. I need to talk to Richie. I'll meet you outside. He wouldn't look at me anymore. Chapter 19, Attack of the Void. Brian. The sun dipped behind the tree line as Gabe drove, casting the world in a fuzzy light that matched my fuzzy thoughts. Reality had rearranged, and I struggled to catch up. My English teacher's son was taking me to my English teacher's house, where apparently Richie and I were spending the night. I got what I wanted, sort of. I wasn't going back to the Wensels. If I had to trust an adult, Mrs. Cleland was a good one. Still, she was my teacher. How awkward would it be to stay at her house? I pictured her with the tall boy in the driver's seat, and I thought about what Gabe told us about his dad. Mrs. Cleland's husband was dead. This knowledge made me feel guilty. She's had enough to be sad about. Gabe had nearly cried when he said it. Some things in the world were scarce, but there was more than enough sadness. Thinking about staying with Mrs. Cleland made me anxious, so I thought about Ezra sitting on Richie's other side. I'd made him laugh like on the bus. Things felt so much easier when it was just us. But it was all complicated, and he knew my mom was in the hospital, and a cop and a social worker were chasing me. He knew my life was a smoking crater after a meteor strike. Maybe he regretted getting involved at all. My pocket buzzed. The text was from Ezra. Are you mad? I'm sorry, I was trying to do the right thing. Sorry? I glanced past Richie. Ezra watched me with bunched up eyebrows like he cared what I thought. It's okay, I answered. I'm not mad. He smiled and started typing. I know it probably feels weird to stay with the teacher, but at least it's Mrs. Cleland. Imagine living with Miss Worth. Our social studies teacher called us citizens, urged us to fight apathy, and held class forums where we were supposed to engage in passionate debate, like future UN ambassadors. She was intense. I bet she'd wake me up with a megaphone, I wrote back. Rise and shine, Citizen Day. Are you ready to make a difference today? Ezra snickered. I'd made him laugh again. Hey, you can text or call whenever if you want to hang out, he replied. I came up with a response less desperate than the truth. Will you always bring pizza? Ezra laughed. Yes, now you know my secret. I'm an immortal pizza wizard. I can summon pepperoni and cheese from the phantom dimension. I couldn't help laughing too. Good to know. When we stopped at Ezra's, he leaned toward me. See you at school tomorrow? I guess, I said. Technically I'm suspended, so I'll probably be stuck in the office. Maybe they'll let you out for lunch. I'll come find you. As he got out, Brittany climbed out too and said something in his ear before she hugged him. We dropped Brittany off next, then Richie and I were alone with Gabe. Richie adored him already, I could tell. He chatted away about video games and school, and Gabe responded with laughter in his voice. Gabe was the teenager who could be on TV, the kind with good looks and confidence and charm, the opposite of me. I sank deeper into the seat. All of this was too strange. The Clelands lived in a yellow house in the West End. A basketball net hung above the garage. As I retrieved my backpack from the trunk, Mrs. Cleland stepped outside. Dressed in jeans and a sweater, she'd transformed from teacher to mom. My gut tightened as Sergeant States appeared behind her. I braced for Kate to show up next, but she didn't. That was a relief. I had a talk with your mom and Miss Evans, Mrs. Cleland said softly. We're all on the same page that you two can stay here for a while, if you're okay with that. Thinking of my mom, Kate, and Mrs. Cleland in the same room made the static in my brain grow louder. I could only nod. She led us inside. Are you hungry? Richie patted his belly. I'm full. Ezra brought pizza. Brian didn't eat any, though. Mrs. Cleland's house was simpler than the Wensels, and there were no cat statues in sight. My eyes drifted to a picture of a happier Mrs. Cleland and a younger Gabe posing beneath a bright red maple tree with a girl who had to be Gabe's sister and a man who was clearly their father, the late Mr. Cleland. My eyes went blurry. Behind me, Mrs. Cleland asked Gabe to show Richie to his room. Richie went happily, no protesting about being separated this time. Sergeant States sat beside me on the couch while Mrs. Cleland hovered in the doorway. I'll skip the lecture. I wouldn't say anything you don't already know, Sergeant States paused. But I need to know if there's a reason you left your foster home. I blinked. I told you the day I didn't want to revisit the memory. I hated it there. I understand, but did anything specific make you feel you had to leave? Any concerns about your safety or well-being or Richie's? He chose his words carefully. Mrs. Cleland watched with concern in her eyes. I realized what Sergeant States was asking. It hit me how serious this was, not only for us, but for the Wensels, two people who only wanted to help a messed up kid. I tensed. No, they didn't. They're not bad people. It's not their fault. I just had to get away. My words wouldn't land right. A weight settled on my chest, pressing harder and harder. Sergeant States lowered his voice. I know it's been tough, Brian. Maybe you're feeling overwhelmed. He knew I was losing it too. I closed my eyes and let out a breath. May I please go to bed? Yes, that's enough for tonight, Oliver. Mrs. Cullen used the same stern tone she did when someone stepped out of line in class. Sergeant States relented. After he left, Mrs. Cullen led me to a room with cream yellow walls plastered with posters of singers. Sorry, it's kind of girly, she said. It's my daughter Lena's room. She's going to college in Montreal and staying there for the summer. For a job, officially, though I think a boy is involved. She was making small talk, telling me about her life. I wanted to respond, but the weight on my chest grew heavier. It wasn't saws exactly. Saws made my brain go into hyperspeed. This was a sludge building up inside, making it hard to do anything. Richie is next door, she continued. The bathroom is across the hall. If you decide you're hungry, help yourself to anything in the kitchen. Make yourself at home. I thanked her, but it came out flat and mechanical, the way you say thanks when a cashier hands back your change. I hated appearing so ungrateful when she was doing so much for me. I just couldn't pull myself together. A pulse in my head thrummed, leave me alone, leave me alone. I didn't even say goodnight to Richie. As soon as Mrs. Cullen left, I climbed into bed. The void swallowed everything and everyone. Mom, Dad, Richie, my whole school. I tried to save them. I ran and screamed, but it took them one by one until I was alone in the universe with the void bearing down on me. When I jolted awake, it was so dark that I couldn't remember where I was, which bedroom, which house. I lay still, waiting for my heart to slow. It didn't. My chest pounded like I'd run 10 sprints on the basketball court. I was awake, but the void was still there, filling the room. It felt like gravity was broken, and I couldn't tell up from down. The bedsheets were soaked in sweat. I kicked back the covers, and the rush of cool air helped me remember. I was in the Collins house. I was safe. But I wasn't safe. My pulse wouldn't slow, and my chest tingled, and I couldn't catch my breath. Something was horribly wrong. Maybe I was having a heart attack. Wave after wave of terrible thoughts pounded me, and I couldn't break through the surface to breathe. I'd been afraid many times about many things, but this was an explosion of fear. All the worst thoughts ripping through my brain at once. Kaboom. Dad is going to jail. Mom is sick. Mom will never get better. Dad will never come back. They're giving up on you. They don't love you enough. You are sick in your brain. Richie knows you're weak. There's something wrong with you. No one likes you. You'll never have friends. Richie's going to leave you too. No one can help you. You will end up alone and no one will ever notice and you are going to die. I shook. I couldn't breathe. The sludge was strangling me. I felt like I was dying. I had to get out of here. The idea was so urgent. My body acted on reflex. Next thing I knew, I stood in the hallway. My belly quivered. I needed someone to save me before I stopped breathing and keeled over, so I stumbled toward the brightest light in the house, a blue flicker in the basement stairwell. Halfway down the steps, my eyes went starry and my stomach caught fire. I had to lean against the banister and wait for my senses to recalibrate. Brian? Whoa, Gabe said somewhere below me. You look awful. I couldn't speak. Gabe guided me to the couch. He paused his PlayStation in the middle of a basketball game. I hunched over my knees, trying to breathe. Are you sick? Gabe asked. Want me to get Mom? Don't go, I croaked. I didn't want to be alone. I'd never felt so helpless. He placed a hand on my shoulder. What's going on? Squeezing out words was so hard. I can't breathe. He studied me. Is your heart racing? You feel out of control? I nodded. Sounds like a panic attack. Try taking deep breaths and letting them out slowly. Gabe rubbed my back. An awful eternity passed before my hammering heart slowed and my stranded fish gasping relented. I felt the coolness of the wood floor against my bare soles. Gabe smelled faintly of sweat and Old Spice, and his hand moved in gentle circles against my ribs. Slowly, slowly, the sludge dispersed. I wasn't going to die. There you go, Gabe said. You're all right. I'm sorry, I said, because that's what I always said. Don't be sorry. It's okay. I wanted to explain, but I didn't know how. As the panic let its claws out of my chest, I felt light and detached from my body. I watched my shoulders twitch and tears flow. I watched as Gabe wrapped his arms around the shuddering, weepy wreck that was Brian Day. It's all right, he said. I got you. Chapter 20, Little by Little. Ezra. Dude, Kevin called. Ezra. Colby, Ty, and Kevin slouched against the fence with outside the basketball court. I almost walked past them without noticing. What's your deal, bro? Colby said. You're so zoned out lately. I think he's in love, Kevin said. Is it Maddie? It felt like a swarm of fire ants were crawling up my neck. Colby laughed. You are so red right now. It is Maddie, isn't it? I swallowed. Grow up, you guys, Ty said. If the man don't want to talk, that's his business. Not everybody has to brag every time a girl looks at them, Colby. They bickered back and forth as we walked into school. I stayed with them, but I barely heard a thing. Brian wasn't in class. I checked before I stepped outside for the morning break. I nearly texted him 12 times, but I didn't want to seem like a stalker. I couldn't stop thinking about him, though, but I couldn't talk to my friends about it because I was afraid where that conversation might lead. I had English with Mrs. Cleland after the break, so I slipped away before the bell to try to catch her before the rest of my class showed up. She looked up from her desk and smiled when I entered. Hi, Ezra. Hey, I closed the door behind me. Is Brian here today? I didn't see him earlier. Her eyes softened. He's home with Gabe. We let him rest after, everything. Oh, I adjusted my glasses. Do you think maybe he'd want to hang out after school? That might be nice. I'd offer you a ride if that's not too strange. She wrinkled her nose. It's all strange, isn't it? Miss Florman and Mr. Hartland didn't know what to think when I told them I wanted to bring Brian home. I hope I'm doing the right thing, but I don't know. The bell rang. Mrs. Cullen looked at me like she wanted my opinion. I definitely think you're doing the right thing, I said. She blinked like she was holding back tears. Before she could say anything else, the door opened and kids started filing in. Mrs. Cullen smiled at me before she turned to greet the others. Before class started, I shot a quick text to Brian. We went to Kevin's at lunch, which was always better than lunch at school, especially when Kevin made dessert. He set a plate on the coffee table in the city's small den. Behold, my newest invention. Colby snorted. Bro, these are donuts. You've never had a donut like this. Try one. I grabbed one and took a bite. Flavors exploded in my mouth. Sweet and salty and doughy and spicy, extremely spicy, all swirling together. Ty hollered for joy. Sweet baby Moses on a jet ski. It's a miracle in my mouth. Kevin's grin widened. Maple, bacon, chili, and a bunch of spices. I took the most Canadian food and made it more Indian and more delicious. I call it the reverse colonizer. Ty took another bite and moaned. He tackled Kevin to the couch and they landed in my lap. I barely avoided squishing maple icing in Kevin's hair. I love you, you spicy genius, Ty declared. Colby shielded his eyes. Easy, bro. Don't turn gay for a donut. A piece of my heart turned to stone, fell out of my chest, and rolled under the couch. I didn't want him to see how much this comment bugged me, so I did what I usually did. I made a joke. Your donuts are magnificent, Kev, but you need a better name that doesn't include colon. Ty got off Kevin and reached for seconds. Call them whatever. I want all your fiery colon donuts. He grinned through a mouthful of dough. You should make these for my party. Kevin pricked up. For real? Your mom said yes? Ty nodded. He'd been scheming for weeks to sell his parents on an end-of-school party. It would be the greatest social event any 7th grader at Halifax North had ever experienced. The party by which all other parties would be measured for the rest of our lives, or at least until high school. That's how Ty and Kevin envisioned it, anyway. We should plan after school, Ty said. Ezra, you're in charge of music. Don't play all weird indie stuff, Kevin added. You have to throw in some bangers. I squirmed. I'll make a playlist, but I can't hang out today. I have plans. Space cult plans? Kevin said sarcastically. Ty laughed. What? Kevin kept watching me. He wasn't going to let me off without answering. I took a breath. I told Brian I'd play ball with him. They looked at me in surprise. Colby's expression was more, ugh, why? You guys hang out now? Kevin asked. I've been talking to him more since, I braced for them to grill me. Brian shrugged. That's decent. Kevin shrugged. That's decent. Sounds like his life is rough right now. What do you mean? Colby said. Brian's brother is Leo's best friend, Kevin said. He's usually here all the time, but he hasn't been around in weeks. He told Leo he's staying with these weird old people, but he couldn't say why. Like foster parents, Ty said? I guess. Now Leo's worried because Richie hasn't been in school this week. So their parents must be screwed up, Colby said. Maybe that's why Brian's so, Colby's tone bugged me. Leave him alone, I said. He has a lot going on. The last thing he needs is people spreading rumors. Everyone stared at me. Ty, Colby, and Kevin bickered all the time, mostly goofing around, but I was usually the chill peacemaker who cracked jokes. I never snapped at Colby. Geez, relax, he shot back. I don't waste time gossiping about Brian. You're the one who's obsessed with him lately. What's your deal? That was the question I was afraid of. I swear a blazing spotlight flicked on above me, hot enough to melt me into a puddle and expose my secrets. Surely Colby was thinking it right now. You're in love with him, aren't you? Gross. His question hung in the air, a balloon expanding with each beat of my silence. A few comebacks came to mind, all defensive or snarky, all guaranteed to make one or both of us feel worse, so I said nothing. We should get back to school, Kevin said. If I have to hear Miss Firth's late for the revolution joke again, I'll jump out the window. Colby gave me a long stare. He was first out the door, and he talked with Kevin on the walk to school. He didn't look back at me, not once. I was mad at him, mad at his don't turn gay crack, and at his I'm so cool now attitude. Mad that he cared more about Victor than Brian. Mad that he cared more about Gemma than me. Mad that after all the time we'd spent together, I couldn't tell him something big without being afraid it would change everything. Mad at myself for being afraid. Mad at the world for being unfair, because everything was changing whether I told him or not. Nat once told me this famous saying she'd learned in college: no man ever steps in the same river twice. It means life keeps moving and nothing is forever. Sometime after we started junior high, the river branched out and Colby and I started drifting apart. Sometimes things change in one big explosion, like whatever happened to Brian. Sometimes the shift happens little by little until it hits you hard on a Wednesday afternoon and you want to cry. Hey, Ty spoke so softly that Kevin and Colby didn't hear. You should invite Brian to my party. You're right, he's a good teammate. He could hang out with us, play ball and stuff. I swallowed. Yeah, that would be cool. Ty punched my shoulder lightly. Kevin's right about music. No sad songs. I want people to have fun, not curl up on the couch and mope. You mean like this? I launched into a super depressing breakup song. Ezra, no, stop that. You're 1,000 miles away, still close enough to make my heart break. I will fight you. Ty tried to stay serious, but he couldn't go a minute without smiling. He nearly snagged me in a headlock, but I squirmed away. He chased me down the sidewalk, both of us laughing. I felt better, but my belly still fluttered on the way back to school. I had told my friends I was on Team Brian, but I was afraid to let them know everything. Would they still be my friends if I did? How long before I had to make a choice?